Welcome to JGTCR, I'm Cope, and today we are tuning the Alfa Romeo Giulia GT AM. Let's get into it. In factory trim, the Giulia GT AM is very tail happy at high RPM. The mid to high range RPM is also quite slippery. When we do experience traction loss, it feels odd and hard to counter. It throws back quite harshly. This does end up leaving us with a sense of unpredictability from this vehicle. The suspension is as soft and sloppy as a wet sponge, making heavy braking and acceleration feel strange and foreign in nature. The sloppy suspension frequently causes the nose to lift, which can equate to a complete loss of steering. The Giulia GT AM is best driven short shifting through the turns, and only going flat out at high RPM on the mostly flat sections of any given circuit. It certainly is fast enough and does handle well if driven somewhat cautiously. Now let's jump to the finish line and collect our time. (7 minutes 24.7 seconds). Onto the tune sheet before heading back out. And here we are with a relatively mild tune for the GT AM. Most of the work on this tune is being done by the aero. The suspension was also tightened to stop body roll, and the diff has been completely locked, cause that's just how we sausage roll. And now back to the track. And what a difference a tune makes. In upgraded form, everything feels much better. In particular, the traction loss feels far more natural. Any oversteer is easy to control and also easy to countersteer without a harsh throwback. The tail end can get squirrely from time to time, but nowhere near as much as it used to. This usually happens on corner exit when pushing a little too hard. However, modulation of the throttle very quickly smooths any issues out. The suspension is now solid and firm, so the vehicle's response to our inputs has now become predictable. We can rev out far more aggressively without the fear of snap oversteer. Short shifting is still advised at times, but not nearly as much as in factory trim. The factory settings of the Giulia GT AM leave a lot to be desired. However, when tuned, it becomes a very different beast. So let's head to the finish line and pick up our time. (6 minutes 21.7 seconds). Onto the drift tune. The GT AM does not like to drift. It does do it reluctantly, kicking and screaming the entire way. After 3 or 4 builds during the session, this is what was settled on. And while it does work, it is quite temperamental. Let's get out on the circuit. From the outside, things look great. The car is sideways, there's lots of smoke, it's all on the up and up. But is it? The problem lies in the way the drift feels. And after numerous builds, that sensation of just being off base remains. Seemingly at random, the vehicle decides it does not want to comply with inputs. This issue remained persistent across all builds and was considerably frustrating. But I digress. The best way to drift the GT AM is gently, a paradox in itself. It has more than enough power to get the job done, but struggles to put it down in a meaningful way. Despite the numerous methods deployed to get some decent push power happening, the rear end is just not having a bar of it, frequently dragging the front end offline. On a more positive note, once the GT AM has settled in its drift, it does have a nice smooth feel. In this space, throttle modulation and finesse is king. The engine is very responsive and willing to light up the tyres at almost any RPM, and while the suspension is moody, it does comply 90% of the time. Unfortunately, that 10% does rear its head at the worst possible time. So if drifting a vehicle with a delicate sensibility seems fun, The Alfa Romeo Giulia GT AM is the perfect vehicle for it. Now on to the helmet cam. As we mangy our way across the start-finish line, we begin experimenting and testing the rev limiter. Being able to hold a drift angle while bouncing off the limiter and remain in control is something to strive towards in any drift build. Unfortunately, the GT-AM is not willing to comply. So after the first 2 turns, we decide to take a less aggressive approach. So after using our push power to conquer the short straight, we switch to a more subtle approach. From here, it's all about throttle modulation and finesse, keeping RPM peaks to a minimum and ensuring our transitions are smooth and fluid. The vehicle seems far more comfortable in higher gears at lower RPM. Backing off to let it breathe and switch, low RPM can hold an angle steady, while 3/4 throttle increases speed and broadens turns. This Alfa Romeo is a lazy drifter. It likes to take things slow and be very chilled, and should we attempt to drift it in any other way, it is more than willing to fight us for it. At the end of the day, it's the GT-AM's way or the highway. We did manage to link the entire circuit, but we never truly felt at one with the vehicle. The Alfa Romeo GT-AM is a strange vehicle. On paper, it has everything it needs to be a great car, but in reality, the suspension is a sloppy mess, and the power delivery is far too peaky even in factory trim. When modified, we gain the ability to tune out some of these issues, making some much needed changes to the handling characteristics. With the assistance of downforce, we are able to ground the tail end. However, throughout all of this, there just always seems to be something off about how it responds to inputs. This is made far more clear when doing more than just a surface level tune. Ultimately, the Alfa Romeo Giulia GT-AM is in the awkward zone. And that's all we have for you today, so until next time, keep racing.